Widowed farmer buried his wife at dawn and found the baby crying at the grave before dusk. The first light of dawn painted the Texas sky in shades of amber and rose, but Ezra McCullough saw none of its beauty. His weathered hands gripped the wooden handle of his shovel as he stood beside the freshly turned earth, where Martha lay. The grave was simple, no headstone yet, just a crude wooden cross he'd fashioned from scraps of their broken fence. Her name was carved deep into the crossbeam, Martha Elizabeth McCullough, beloved wife, 145-273, 28 years old, gone from fever that had swept through the small valley like wildfire, claiming 3 other souls before the week was through. Ezra had nursed her for 6 days, watching helplessly as the life drained from her cornflower blue eyes. Doc Peterson had ridden out from Whitfield once, taken one look and shaken his head gravely. "Keep her comfortable," he'd said. "That's all anyone can do now." The last shovelful of dirt fell with a hollow thump. Ezra removed his hat and stood in the silence, watching the sun climb higher over the endless expanse of prairie grass that stretched to the horizon. Their homestead, his homestead now sat like a small island in that sea of green. The modest cabin he'd built with his own hands, the barn where their 3 remaining cattle lowed softly, the chicken coop Martha had insisted on painting yellow because it reminded her of sunshine. "You don't know how to do this without you, Martha," he whispered to the grave. His voice was hoarse from crying, though no tears came now. He felt hollow as a dried gourd, emptied of everything that had once made him whole. The wind picked up, rustling through the cottonwoods he'd planted when they first claimed this land 5 years ago. Martha had said they needed trees for shade, for beauty, for the promise of permanence. "A home isn't a home without roots growing deep," she told him. Now those trees stood like sentinels over her final resting place. Ezra replaced his hat and walked back toward the cabin, his boots crunching on the dry grass. The sun was fully up now, promising another scorching day. He had work to do, cattle to tend, a broken fence to mend, crops to harvest alone. Life had to continue, even when it felt like it had ended with Martha's last breath. The day passed in a blur of mechanical motions. Ezra milked their cow, Bessie, and fed the chickens. He repaired the fence post that had been broken in last week's storm, his hands moving automatically while his mind wandered. Every task reminded him of Martha, how she'd always insisted on gathering the eggs herself because she said the hens liked her better, how she'd stand at the kitchen window watching him work in the fields, ready with cool water and a gentle word when he came in. As the afternoon wore on, the heat became oppressive. The sun beat down mercilessly, and not even the slightest breeze stirred the air. Ezra's shirt was soaked with sweat as he worked to clear an irrigation ditch that had become clogged with debris. The physical labor was a blessing. It kept his hands busy and his mind from dwelling too long on his grief. But as the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, Ezra found himself drawn back to the grave. It had become a habit his past 2 days since Martha's passing. Standing there as evening approached, talking to her as if she could still hear him. "Got the fence fixed," he said, settling down on the ground beside the fresh mound of earth. "That old post finally gave up the ghost. Remember how you always said it was leaning too far? Should have listened to you sooner." He picked up a handful of the loose soil and let it run through his fingers. "Doc Peterson stopped by this morning, wanted to check on me, make sure I was eating. He told him I was fine. But you know how I am with cooking. Burned the bacon again." The light was fading fast now, stars beginning to twinkle in the darkening sky. Ezra knew he should go inside, tend to the evening chores, but he couldn't bring himself to leave. Being near Martha's grave felt like the only place where the crushing weight of loneliness lifted, even slightly. That's when he heard it. At first, he thought it might be a coyote in the distance, or perhaps one of the barn cats. But as he listened more carefully, his blood ran cold. It was unmistakably human, the wailing cry of an infant, somewhere nearby. Ezra shot to his feet, scanning the gathering darkness. The sound seemed to be coming from the grave. What in tarnation, he muttered, moving closer. The crying grew louder, more desperate. With trembling hands, he struck a match and held it high. In the flickering light, he saw something that made his heart nearly stop. There, in a shallow depression at the head of Martha's grave, a depression that definitely hadn't been there when he'd finished the burial that morning, lay a baby. A real, living, breathing infant, wrapped in what appeared to be a tattered blue blanket. The child couldn't have been more than a few months old, with a shock of dark hair and lungs strong enough to wake the dead. Ezra stood frozen for a moment, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. Where had this baby come from? The nearest neighbor was the Hendersons, 5 miles to the east, and their children were all grown. There was no way a baby could have just appeared. The match burned down to his fingers, and he dropped it with a curse. In the darkness, the infant's cries intensified. Whatever impossible circumstances brought this child here, it was clearly in distress. Ezra's paternal instincts, dormant since he and Martha had never been blessed with children of their own, suddenly blazed to life. He scooped up the baby. It was surprisingly warm, despite the cooling night air, and hurried toward the cabin. "Easy there, little one," he murmured, amazed at how natural it felt to hold a child. "Let's get you inside where it's safe." In the warm glow of the oil lamp, Ezra got his first clear look at the mysterious infant. It was a boy, perhaps 3 or 4 months old, with the most unusual eyes Ezra had ever seen, a striking blue-green that seemed to shimmer in the lamplight. The baby's cries had quieted to small hiccups, now that he was being held, and he stared up at Ezra with an intelligence that seemed far beyond his age. "Where did you come from, little fellow?" Ezra whispered, gently touching the infant's soft cheek. "And how, in God's name, did you end up on my Martha's grave?" The next few hours passed in a whirlwind of improvisation. Ezra had no experience with babies, but desperation and instinct guided him. He warmed some milk from Bessie and fed it to the child using a clean rag as a makeshift nipple, a technique he vaguely remembered his mother using with orphaned lambs years ago. The baby drank hungrily, which Ezra took as a good sign. He fashioned a crude crepe from one of Martha's sewing baskets, padding it with her softest shawls. The baby he'd taken to calling him Thomas, after Martha's father, seemed content enough, gurgling softly as he gazed around the cabin with those remarkable eyes. But as the night wore on, Ezra's mind churned with questions. He'd ridden out to check the perimeter of his property twice, looking for any sign of travelers who might have lost a child or abandoned one. Nothing. The nearest road was 7 miles away, and nobody passed through this isolated valley without a damn good reason. More puzzling still was the condition of the baby himself. Despite being found outdoors, Thomas showed no signs of exposure. His skin was healthy, his breathing clear, and he seemed well fed. It was as if he'd simply materialized on Martha's grave, perfectly cared for and waiting to be found. "This doesn't make a lick of sense," Ezra muttered, pacing the cabin floor, while Thomas slept peacefully in his makeshift bed. "Babies don't ghost fall from the sky." But even as he said it, a strange thought crept into his mind. Martha had always wanted children. It had been the one shadow over their otherwise happy marriage, month after month of hoping, praying, only to be disappointed. She'd begun to believe it was God's will, that they were meant to find their purpose in other ways, but Ezra had seen the longing in her eyes whenever they encountered families in town, the way she'd light up around children. "If you had anything to do with this, Martha," he said softly, glancing toward the window where her grave lay hidden in darkness, "I don't know whether to thank you or have my head examined." Ezra hitched up his wagon and rode into Whitfield, the baby carefully bundled in a basket beside him. If anyone in the small frontier town had heard news of a missing child, Sheriff Dalton would know about it. Whitfield was typical of the cattle towns that had sprung up across Texas in recent years. A wide main street lined with false-fronted buildings, a handful of saloons, a general store, and not much else. Ezra pulled up in front of the sheriff's office, a modest building that also served as the jail. Sheriff Jim Dalton was a grizzled veteran of the war between the states, a man who'd seen enough of the world to be surprised by very little. But when Ezra told him about finding Thomas on Martha's grave, even Dalton's weathered features showed astonishment. "You found him where exactly?" Dalton asked, leaning back in his chair. "Right there on the grave, in a little hollow that wasn't there when I finished the burial yesterday morning." Dalton stroked his gray beard thoughtfully. "Any sign of tracks? Footprints? Horse hooves?" "Nothing. I looked everywhere. It's like he just appeared." "Ezra, you know how that sounds, don't you? Crazy as a barn owl, I know. But I'm telling you the truth, Jim. This baby came from nowhere." The sheriff stood and walked to the window, gazing out at the bustling street. "Well, I'll tell you what I know. Ain't been any reports of missing children in 3 counties. Miss Ferguson at the orphanage in San Antonio sent word last month asking if we had any families looking to adopt. Seems they're overflowing with youngsters. Nobody wants, but nothing about a lost baby." Ezra felt a strange mixture of relief and apprehension. If no one was looking for Thomas, then perhaps, but no, he was getting ahead of himself. "What do you reckon I should do?" he asked. Dalton turned back to him with a slight smile. "Way I see it, you got yourself a baby to raise. Lord knows Martha would have wanted that. Maybe this is his way of answering prayers that seemed to go unheard." The weeks that followed brought profound changes to Ezra's life. Caring for Thomas filled the empty hours that had stretched endlessly after Martha's death. The baby was remarkably easy. He slept through the night, rarely fussed, and seemed to thrive on the simple fare of warm milk, and as he grew older, soft foods that Ezra learned to prepare. More surprising still were the changes in Ezra himself. The crushing grief that had threatened to destroy him began to lift, replaced by a sense of purpose he hadn't expected to feel again. Thomas needed him, depended on him completely, and that responsibility became a lifeline, pulling him back from the brink of despair. The boy grew quickly, developing faster than any child Ezra had ever seen. By 2 months after his mysterious arrival, Thomas was sitting up on his own. His unusual eyes seemed to take in everything around him with an awareness that was almost unsettling. He rarely cried, but when he did, it was always for a clear reason: hunger, discomfort, or the need for attention. It was Doc Peterson who first noticed the truly extraordinary thing about Tom. "This boy," the doctor said, during one of his regular visits to check on them both, "he's developing at twice the normal rate. Look at his muscle tone, his coordination, and those eyes. I've never seen anything like them." Ezra had noticed it too. Thomas seemed to understand far more than he should, responding to his name and to simple commands with an intelligence that defied explanation. When Ezra worked around the homestead, the baby would watch intently from his basket, following every movement as if memorizing the tasks for future reference. "Maybe he's just special," Ezra said, though privately he wondered if there wasn't more to it than that. The answer, or at least part of it, came on a crisp autumn evening 3 months after Thomas's arrival. Ezra was sitting on the porch, holding the baby while they watched the sunset paint the sky in brilliant reds and golds. Martha's grave was visible from where they sat, marked now by a proper headstone that Ezra had ordered from San Antonio. Thomas, now clearly 6 months old, though he'd been found as a 3-month-old infant, was babbling contentedly when he suddenly went quiet. His remarkable eyes fixed on something behind Ezra, and his face lit up with the kind of joy Ezra had never seen in a child so young. Turning to follow the baby's gaze, Ezra felt his heart stop. Martha stood there, translucent in the fading light, but unmistakably herself. She wore the same blue dress she'd been buried in, and her face held the gentle smile that had been the last thing Ezra saw before she closed her eyes forever. "Hello, my love," she said, her voice like wind through the cottonwoods. Ezra couldn't speak, couldn't breathe. Thomas reached out his tiny hands toward the apparition, making soft cooing sounds of recognition. "I know you have questions," Martha continued, moving closer with that familiar, graceful step. "And I don't have long to explain, Martha, how love is stronger than death, Ezra. Is stronger than the boundaries between worlds. When I passed, I couldn't bear to leave you alone with all that pain. So I asked for help." "Asks who?" Her smile grew sad and beautiful. "There are forces in this world, old powers that most folks have forgotten. They listen sometimes to those who love deeply enough to sacrifice everything. I offered to give up my eternal rest, my chance to move on to whatever comes next, in exchange for something to ease your suffering." Ezra looked down at Thomas, who was still reaching toward Martha, with obvious delight. The baby, a soul in need of a home, a father in need of a purpose. The powers that be, they arrange things. Thomas isn't ordinary, is something special. A bridge between worlds, a child touched by forces beyond our understanding. He'll grow faster than normal children, learn things that can't be taught, see things others cannot. Is he human enough? He has a human soul, human needs, human capacity for love. But he's also something more. He'll need your guidance, your love, your steady hand to help him navigate what he is. Thomas had begun to fuss, reaching more insistently toward Martha. She drifted closer, and though she was clearly incorporeal, the baby seemed to sense her presence with perfect clarity. "I can't stay much longer," Martha said, her form already beginning to fade. "But I needed to explain, to make sure you understood. Thomas is my gift to you, Ezra. My last act of love. Raise him well, teach him right from wrong, and he'll bring more joy to your life than you can imagine." "Don't go," Ezra whispered, tears streaming down his face. "Please, Martha, don't leave me again. I have to." This was the bargain, one final visit to explain. "Then I must accept my rest, but I'm not really leaving, love. I'll be watching from wherever good souls go, and every time you hold that boy, every time you see him smile, you'll be feeling my love through him." She began to fade more rapidly now, becoming little more than a shimmer in the twilight air. "Love him, Ezra. Love him as we would have loved our own children, and know that in doing so, you're loving me too." And then she was gone, leaving only the whisper of wind through the trees and the sweet scent of the wild flowers she'd always favored. The years that followed were unlike anything Ezra could have imagined. Thomas grew into a remarkable child, brilliant, kind, possessed of an uncanny wisdom that often left his adoptive father marveling. By age 5, though only 2 years had passed since his arrival, the boy could read fluently, handle livestock with the skill of someone twice his age, and possessed an intuitive understanding of the natural world that bordered on the mystical. He could predict weather changes days in advance, knew instinctively when animals were sick or injured, and had a way with crops that made their small farm the most productive in the valley. Word of the boy's unusual gifts spread, and neighbors began seeking his advice on everything from planting schedules to treating ailing cattle. But Thomas remained, at his core, simply a loving child who adored his father and brought laughter back to a home that had known too much sorrow. He never asked about his origins. Somehow, he seemed to understand that he was where he belonged. On quiet evenings, when they sat together on the porch watching the sunset, Ezra would sometimes catch a glimpse of movement near Martha's grave, a flutter of blue fabric, a flash of golden hair in the fading light. Thomas always saw it too, his unusual eyes following the phantom presence with a smile of recognition. "She's watching," the boy said once when he was 7 years old and tall as a 10-year-old. "You can see her, sometimes. She's happy, Papa. She's proud of us both." Ezra pulled him closer, marveling at the strange turn his life had taken. He'd buried his beloved wife at dawn, certain that his world had ended. By dusk, he'd found a gift that proved love truly was stronger than death, a child who embodied all the hope and joy Martha had brought to his life, wrapped in a mystery that deepened rather than diminished his faith. As the star emerged in the darkening sky, father and son sat in comfortable silence, watched over by a love that transcended the boundaries between earth and heaven. In the distance, the cottonwoods rustled with a sound like whispered blessings, and for the first time since Martha's passing, Ezra McCullough knew with absolute certainty that his family was complete. The boy beside him was living proof that some prayers are answered in ways beyond human understanding, and that the greatest miracles often come not from the heavens above, but from the love that refuses to let go, even in death.